Pratya, when you're done, you'll make me host because I'm not able to share my screen.
Pinky, which one should I make the host? There are
The
two.
PC one, Pinky PC.
Okay. We are live on YouTube, huh?
All right. Pratya, I'm just checking about that. Uh, Pradnya, even you can see it now, right? Anita, I think we can start letting people in.
Pinky, and let them in.
Yeah, I think you can.
Okay.
अरे उसका मालूम है वो छुट्टी इंटरनेट बंद हो जाता है
Hello, Dr. Todd Scherer. Hello, Dr. Todd. Can you hear me? I've made you the co-host.
Okay. Can you hear me
Can
now?
you try
Pink?
unmuting now? Yeah.
Yes. Can you hear me
Great.
now?
Yeah, I can.
Okay, great. Good morning or good afternoon.
Good morning. Good morning to you. Do you want to try running through your slides? You can try sharing screens.
Yeah. And shall I go on video?
You can turn it on, or we could even just check your slides for now.
Okay. Can you see them?
Yeah, we can, but it's not full screen yet. Yeah, now it's full screen.
Okay. For some reason, oh, there we go. So it looks like everything.
Yeah, it seems to be working fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's always good.
Good. So I'll be beginning today's event with, a short introduction to Venture Center and TechX. After which, Dr. Singla, he'll be talking very briefly about Emory, India. And then I'll be introducing you to the audience, and then you can take over.
Great. Thank you.
So we'll wait for maybe another 5 minutes for people to join.
Pinky, did you get Nikhil's note about being unmuted?
Could you just repeat that again?
And are you admitting people into the room? Yeah, you are.
I think I'll start now. So good evening, everyone. And I'll just share my screen. Is my screen visible to everyone? Can everyone hear me?
Yes, Pinky, we can.
All right. Okay. So I'll just start with today's event. So welcome again to everyone who has joined us today. We are delighted to have Dr. Todd Scherer join us for the talk today, which is being co-organized by TechX at Venture Center and Emory, India. Before we start with today's talk, I will be talking very briefly about Venture Center and TechX. Dr. Nikhil Singla, Country Director of Emory, India, will then be talking about Emory, India, and then we will begin Dr. Todd's talk. Venture Center is an award-winning Section 8 not-for-profit a technology business incubator hosted by CSIR NCL. Venture Center is the first incubator in the CSIR network and the largest science business incubator in India. I am also very pleased to share that the Bio Incubator Adventure Center was very recently ranked as #1 in the Pan India Bio Incubator survey of more than 40 bio incubators by Biospectrum India, which is a leading B2B media platform for life sciences. Venture Center is celebrating 15 years this year, and over the years, we have tried to build a very comprehensive ecosystem that supports entrepreneurs with access to a variety of world-class resources, consisting of specialized facilities, scientific facilities, IP help, funding options, mentoring, etc. We also host a number of unique resource centers, and I would encourage people to go and check out our ISO 13485 certified MedTech clean room facility. We add our various services that are offered by the Center for Biopharma Analysis, the Regulatory Information and Facilitation Center, and TechX. We have supported over 600 entrepreneurs so far, and we have facilitated the creation of 11 spin-off companies from CSIR NCL. 85% of our startups are still active, and our startups supported have raised over 500 crores in risk capital and have generated almost 1,000 crores in revenue in the last 6 years. TechX is a resource center of Venture Center that is supported by the National Biopharma Mission. It was set up to support technology commercialization, and we do that by offering a variety of services such as tech marketing, tech transfer, IP support, search and analytics support, etc. You can check out the full range of services that we offer at our website, techx.in. I would now request Dr. Nikhil Singla to tell our audience today about Emory India.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. Pinky, is my video working as well?
Yeah, it is.
Okay.
We can see you. Yeah.
Okay, great. For some reason, I don't have it on my screen. But anyways, thank you so much for the kind introduction, Pinky. And also sincere thanks to Dr. Premnath, yourself, and the TechX Venture Center team for the support in organizing this webinar. Special thanks to Todd for making time for this webinar. Looking forward to hearing from you, Todd, on the critical aspects in enabling translation and commercialization of healthcare innovations, particularly from a perspective through your leadership role at Emory's Office of Technology Transfer. A very warm welcome to all the participants, and thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Dr. Nikhil Singla, leading the efforts of the Emory India entity. The formulation of the Emory India entity is a step forward in affirming Emory University's commitment to sustainable and impactful engagements in India. This builds on our long-standing commitment and work in India, with some facts such as Indian students form one of the largest groups on Emory campuses. Many alumni are spread across major Indian cities. Faculty have received high recognition in India, including the Padma Bhushan Award. Several accomplished faculty members from different disciplines at Emory have research collaborations with Indian partners. One such exemplary partnership is between the Emory Vaccine Center and a premier research institution in Delhi. The work in this joint lab, which has been, successfully working on scientific outputs for over a decade now, is focused on infectious diseases research, including that in COVID-19. So building on these, the focus of the new Emory entity that we have established in India is to further strengthen and expand the partnerships and collaboration with Indian partners. And with this, we look forward to working with more and more of you. If there are any more details that are required, my contact details are on the slide. Please feel free to reach out. And thank you so much again.
Am I up now?
Pinky,
Yeah,
should,
Yeah.
yeah, I think Pinky
Yeah.
can just open the event up. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Dr. Singla. We will now be starting with today's talk on translation of healthcare innovations, lessons learned from the US and Emory University. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker for today. Dr. Todd is the Associate Vice President of Research and Executive Director for the Office of Tech Transfer at Emory. He has worked extensively with researchers to translate their promising scientific and medical discoveries into new products that benefit society. This crucial activity helps assure that research is translated into practical applications, including new life-saving medical products that benefit the public who have helped fund it. He has helped pioneer new funding models to support the translation of research and has worked globally to identify, test, and implement best practices to increase the impact of academic tech commercialization. He has also worked with colleagues to effect federal policy and guidelines that address new intellectual property flowing from federally funded research. Among his other achievements, he holds a PhD degree in pharmacology and toxicology from Washington State University. He has been past president of Autumn and is a registered patent agent with the United States Patent and Trademark Office. He is also a certified licensing professional and a registered tech transfer professional. I would now like to welcome Dr. Todd to begin his presentation.
Good evening, everyone. Hopefully you can see my slides. I appreciate you taking time at the end of a very long day to join me in a conversation on one of my favorite topics, and that is just innovation, particularly innovation that is spawned from universities. So thank you, Dr. Pinky and Nikhil, for the great introduction, and to Premna too for hosting this event and giving us an opportunity at Emory to further collaborate and explore partnerships with our colleagues in India. So what I thought I would do is just organize my talk into sort of some lessons that I feel like and common themes that I feel like have come up for me again and again over the years. It's interesting to think about how much has changed in tech transfer and in innovation, particularly in and around universities over the last 30 years. And I hope to share some of those lessons with you. And I'm going to assume that most of them will resonate. If not, I look forward to a conversation, and hopefully there'll be time for questions. This is the agenda of my remarks. I thought I would talk just a little bit about background, because I think background is important. I think what's going on in the innovation space and what you have available to you depends a lot on where you're at, not just within what country, but also within a particular area within your country or a city or even a university or company. Innovation ecosystems are popping up all over the place, and they don't just exist at the national level. They exist, of course, globally, but they also exist at a micro level too. And a lot of innovation happens through individual contacts. So our innovation ecosystems are critical, and understanding them is critical to our success. Then I kind of organized my comments into these 8 different lessons. Did I have 8? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I want to start with talking a little bit about our innovation ecosystems. Then I want to talk about establishing IP ownership and why that's so crucial. And I put that in red because I think that is one of the most critical things to get right that so often is not done right. And I don't understand why it would be something that anyone starting a new business or company would leave untouched. IP protection, then talk a little bit about proof of concept funding, facilities, and mentorship and their role in the innovation ecosystem. The importance of risk reduction and value creation. It is the name of the game, particularly in medical technologies. Knowing when to start a company, knowing when to quit, And then also just in that with some tips for licensing. So this is the background, and I won't dwell on this too much because it was in the abstract that came out with this webinar announcement. But I did want to summarize it and to say that in the US, the federal government has emerged as a primary funding source for research at universities. And it's been this way for some time. It's been this way for a number of decades. And it's important because where your funding comes from tells you a lot about the culture around your innovation ecosystem. And the fact that so much of our funding comes from the federal government tells us a number of things. It tells us that it's going to be important that we do things for public good, and that it's not okay to shelve technologies, for example. It also gives the federal government certain rights to inventions that arise from its funding. All of these things impact our innovation ecosystem. They set the tone and culture at universities and also reach far into the innovation ecosystem because our federal government has gotten more and more into even applied research. In some ways, they've actually stepped into funding the kinds of things that the biotech industry used to really excel at. At my university, like most research-intensive universities in this country, not only most of our funding comes from the federal government, and it's a pretty high ratio. It's probably around 70% for most major universities. And that's going to then also set the tone and the culture within our respective institutions. It surprises a lot of people that I talk to. Even my colleagues today are still convinced that companies probably fund the bulk of research at places like Emory, but they don't. It tends to only be about 10% of our funding that comes from industry. The other thing we know from decades of licensing survey data is that there is a very strong correlation between research funding and the number of new inventions. So research is going to drive new inventions. When I was Autumn president, I had a chance to travel the world. And what was interesting and amazing to me to see was that pretty much every country had figured out how to do tech transfer. The difference maker was that in many of these countries, there wasn't a lot of research funding. And without a lot of research funding, there was not a lot of tech transfer activity. The Bayh-Dole Act was a instrumental act, public law that happened in 1980 in the US. Again, from having traveled the world, I know that this public law has been emulated in many other countries. And it gave us the ability to elect title to our inventions. It was crucial in setting up a vibrant, robust innovation ecosystem in the United States, because prior to that, the federal government owned these inventions, and the ability to elect title locally to an invention that was made locally and then develop it locally was critical, as it turns out, to the success of doing something with these new inventions. Trying to manage them from Maryland or Washington, DC, and represent research that was happening on the West Coast, for example, just was never going to work. It also tells you that our tech transfer system is about 40 years old. And it tells you that we've been around long enough for, I don't know whether I would say we're at the mature stage of our culture and of our innovation ecosystem. But if we're not, we must be close. Again, if the timelines it takes to get new medical technologies to market, as we started to see invention disclosures popping up at our universities in the decade or so that followed 1980, unless the first one in the door was fortunate enough to be a big hit, it told us that by simply looking at the numbers, we weren't going to see big technologies, particularly therapeutics, for 20 or more years, because we had to see enough technologies start to come through our doors and out-license those and have a long enough time frame for those to eventually hit the market. We do have a very mature venture capital industry. It serves us well in this country. They are so mature that they do a lot of due diligence into investing, and they've actually steered away from very early stage investing. So we started with a big gap, then seed funds came along, and then seed funds went away. And they went away particularly in the life sciences area because of the cramming down and the high capital requirements of these types of startup companies. And so we still have gaps that exist in our funding pathway and also have major challenges in identifying management talent. There's a lot of talk about startups in our country and probably in yours as well. But it's important to remember that they represent only about 20 to 30% by the numbers of deals that are done out of an academic tech transfer office. And so knowing when to launch a new company versus doing business with an existing company is important, but we don't very often have a choice. We most often only have one party interested in a deal. So that is some background that sort of sets the stage nationally. If we take a look at Atlanta and the challenges we face at Emory University, we're not in a biocluster. We are in a pretty heavily populated state in the Southeast, but as you can see, the three top bioclusters in the United States are in Boston, New York, New Jersey, and San Francisco. And so that's where most of the action is going on. That's where the venture capital is condensed. And it's been difficult for those of us in cities and states and regions outside of those biopharma clusters to really be successful in attracting money and people. The one thing I will say that has happened that I think has really been to our benefit is the pandemic. Because of the pandemic and because of the need to work virtually and the expectation that people were going to work virtually, I feel like it's flattened the world some. So it's been more acceptable for VCs to think about starting up companies outside their own buyer cluster because they don't have to worry about jumping on an airplane to go to a board meeting because they can't do that. Those have all taken place virtually. So I'm hoping that at least part of this hybrid virtual remote working world will stick because, again, I think it's helped flatten the world a bit with for those of us that are not in biocluster areas, but who do have a lot of good science going on and want to see that science turned into exciting new medical products. Emory University is a private university. I've worked at private and public universities on both coasts now. There are some differences in our state, in the United States, between public and privates. Privates tend to be a little less risk averse. They're not quite as impacted by state laws and regulations, which might limit their ability to negotiate in certain ways. It also puts less pressure on us to do a low cost deal. We're more able to go out and pursue whatever fair market deal is at a private university because we don't have as much public funding. And along with that public funding often comes expectations about easy access, and easy access often turns into a low cost deal. So we're a private university. We don't have a large student population, only about 16,000 students, equally divided between graduate and undergraduate. But we do have a large number of employees. We've got 38,000 employees because of the Emory healthcare system. And so our sweet spot is that we are an academic health center. We have hospitals, we conduct a lot of clinical trials, and we are in a very large metropolitan area. So Emory, for example, participated as a clinical trial site in the development of all of the COVID technologies. And we were the largest enroller for some of these drugs, for example, like remdesivir. I wanted to just briefly glance by this. I know there's too much on this product pipeline for you to digest. It certainly is on our website if you're interested in taking a closer look. But I wanted to show you this because when I got into tech transfer in 1990, the mantra was that nobody would ever make money or really have success in tech transfer except for Stanford, Wharf, and MIT. But look at this. Little old Emory University has had a major impact in healthcare and in saving lives. If you look at our therapeutic pipeline, you see all of these drug combinations of 3TC and FTC. Those are HIV drug combinations. And so today, over 90% of people on life-saving antiviral therapy for HIV are taking a drug discovered at Emory because our drug is in those various combos. And so it's pretty fantastic to be at a university and have that kind of an impact on saving lives. You can also see, and one of the important things to me is how many clinical stage assets do we have as a program? These are technologies that are in phase 1, 2, or 3 development. And you can see we've got quite a number of those. And that's important to me because that's the number of shots on goal for us. If 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 technologies or new therapeutics that enter clinical trials get approved, then we've got a bright future. I've also put a few of our preclinical stage assets, but we have more preclinical stage assets under license than what this product pipeline shows. You can see we've had similar success in consumer products, diagnostic device products, and we've seen a number of those hit the market as well. And you learn a lot about how to do your business as products get all the way to the market. One of the things you learn is that products get to the market and they start to generate revenue is people start to reinterpret license agreements. So I've been through litigation, mediation, arbitration, and some preliminary dispute resolutions in order to resolve differences in opinions over our license agreements. This just shows you that we've had a number of different startups, again, clustered in the diagnostic device and pharma space. Because we're so heavily driven by what happens at our School of Medicine, most of our technologies, 98% of the technologies we get disclosed are all in the life sciences space. So that's important too, because that means that my comments are really going to reflect experiences in the life sciences sectors. If you were at a university and you've got a large school of engineering, some of your experiences will vary. So the first sort of lesson I wanted to share is that establishing IP ownership is crucial. I mean, this sounds a little bit silly and it sounds a little bit obvious, but I am shocked that after 30 years, how many times I see people and companies just get this wrong. I guess they don't think it's that important, or that maybe nobody will find out. I mean, one of the inherent features and benefits of patent protection is that there is an obligation to get inventorship correct. And if it's wrong, somebody can discover that years later, and it'll have a great impact on your patent and also on any licenses that you would have granted. It gets complicated, IP ownership does. It can be jointly owned, and in some cases with many parties. We've got some technologies that are owned by 6 or 7 different parties. I think the record I've seen is like 14 or 15 when you get into the copyright spaces. You can also contract them away. In our clinical trial research, we'll often contract away, own our rights to own IP. If it's at the clinical stages of development and we're testing a company's device or a company's therapeutic. We've got a lot of sponsors. Not only do we have the federal government, but we have foundations. We might outsource some of our work to contractors, particularly in the software space. Those contractors have certain rights unless you put contracts into place that address IP. And all of these things are going to affect IP ownership. As a matter of fact, if I were running my own startup company, I would do heavy diligence on my IP ownership, and I would make sure that I put this in front of investors. Maybe not in my initial pitch deck, but I would have it all done and documented, and I would show that I went to great lengths to take a look at everybody's employment obligations. It's one of the things you can do at the very early stages, and it should be the first thing you do in putting a company together. And so why not do it in a way right from the outset that's going to impress your investors down the road. This is one that is important, but people seem to get it most of the time, not all of the time. IP protection is risky, it's expensive, and generally people understand that it's necessary. But I see some sort of critical mistakes happening all the time. And one of those is that this really is a giant snowball chasing you down the hill. And as you continue down your prosecution, it will get more and more expensive. And if you're not successful in reaching your funding goals as aggressively or as early as you had hoped, then you're going to find out that patent expenses become a bigger and bigger burden on the startup company. So, for example, that notion that you had when you started to just patent everywhere, assuming that by the time you got to the national phase, that you would have investment, may not have been such a great strategy. It might be that a more modest strategy of protecting certain countries and countries of interest was the best way to start, because it saved more capital and gave you a longer runway to get further. It's also a problem that we run into is just filing too early. So it is important to file early. Most countries are first to invent, but by filing too early, you increase the odds that your invention will change, and it'll advance and it'll emerge over time, and you'll end up with not just one patent family, but maybe 2 or 3. We can easily find ourselves in the national stage of patent prosecution with technologies where we've invested $200,000 to $300,000 in the patent estate before we ever get a licensee on board. So if we're licensing it out earlier during our first filing, then that's happening to our startup companies as well. And that's a big financial burden to carry. The other mistake that I see happen all the time with startup companies that really surprise me is that the management team doesn't get engaged in the patent prosecution. As a matter of fact, they often don't know anything about the patent prosecution and how it works. And one of the single greatest things you can do to create company in a very early stage company where you're just managing an asset is to make sure that your IP position is rock solid as it can be. I always admire it when I see a CEO or an interim industry expert that's helping us out with a startup who really wants to get engaged and get on the phone calls with patent counsel. By the time we, if we license to pharma companies, and in particular, by the time we get into the clinical stages of development, those pharma companies are sitting at the table with us. They've got their own counsel, and in many cases, they're reimbursing our patent counsel, and they're paying for their own patent counsel because they are watching, the patent prosecution and engaging in it at the most detailed level possible to make sure that every decision is carefully vetted and heavily vetted, and that the best decision is made about with regards to those patents moving forward. This is one of the things that's changed a lot over the last several decades, and that is the availability of resources for companies. 30 years ago, there weren't many. You had a university you could license it from. You had investors you could work with. You could go out and find a few industry experts, but there wasn't a lot more resources available than that. Resources like the Venture Center, for example. Now, our innovation ecosystems are crowded, and they're crowded in a good way, because it really does take a village to raise a startup. And this can be challenging for a lot of our academic, for a lot of our faculty-driven startups out of the university, because if they are faculty and they've got full-time jobs at the university, they may not have the time it takes to really manage a startup, or even to understand what's available to them in the innovation ecosystem. So I think it is your job, if you are engaged in early stage startup companies, to really evaluate your innovation ecosystem and find out all of the various support that is available to you. It's amazing how much of it these days is even available for free. And it is true that you can get a lot of different opinions about what to do, which is one of the reasons why I think it's important to get a lot of opinions, to look for sort of emerging trends in the messages that come out in those partners and stakeholders. So it's great to have access to physical space. It's great to have access to mentors. It's great to have access to funding programs that might provide non-dilutive funding, business plan competitions, you name it. There are all sorts of resources available out there. So know your ecosystem and take advantage of it. It's just, it's just sort of irresponsible not to do that because there's so much money at risk that you need to know what's available to you and to your company so that you can do everything possible to increase your odds of being successful. This is another message that I think on the one hand is fairly obvious, but I'm amazed to see how often it's overlooked. And that is that you just simply can't avoid that running the gauntlet to the market for a medical device or a therapeutic in particular, and not recognize that you're in the business of risk reduction and value creation. This graph on your left shows that out of 10,000 compounds discovered, only one is expected to get FDA approval. The other thing is that the law of the land in the innovation space is that more money becomes available as risk is reduced. And that does set up a real dilemma. If you're starting on day one when risk is your highest and you need a lot of money and you need money to reduce your risk, how are you going to get it when the risk is at its highest? So we have to find ways to reduce risk. And certainly by the time things get into clinical stages of development, whether that's a device or a therapeutic, everyone seems to be pretty focused on this. But in the early stages of getting companies up and running, it's amazing how long it takes our startups to get to this point. For example, just defining their killer experiment. I see them get asked this question over and over again. And I so often see some of our companies 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the road, and they still can't define their killer experiment. You have to know what your killer experiment is. You at least have to know what investors think your killer experiment is. And it may not be a single experiment. It may vary depending upon who you're talking to, but that's still important. Because there can be different value inflection points. And that's okay. But again, you've got to have a real sense for this. You've got to have a real answer for this. And in the tech transfer office, we're in the same business too. We're in the business of risk reduction and value creation. If we get a technology in the door, our job is to de-risk it. We need to look into who owns it. And as we start to figure out who owns it, whether it's just the university or a sponsor has rights, or it's co-owned with other universities, or it's jointly owned with a company, as we figure those things out and get that taken care of through interinstitutional agreements, we start to reduce risk and increase value. As we file patents and move through the patent prosecution stages, we're starting to reduce value as well. So I'm going to, I guess just maybe one more last point is to make sure that you vet value inflection points as broadly as possible. So this is always an interesting dilemma that I have seen us in over the years that we still continue to face at the university today. And that is just when do you start a company? Because if you start too early, you've started to incur debt at a time when the company is at such an early stage, it's not ready to get investment or to get funding. And so you can just run into a lot of challenges. You get your company started, you license in your technology, and now all of a sudden it's 2, 3 years down the road, you're starting to get stale and you haven't really been able to increase value. A major driver for us in when we get a startup going is kind of purely and simply based upon our availability to find funding. So if we can find funding through the university, and we do have some non-dilutional translational funding resources available to us, if we can do that, then we'll attempt to try to keep the technology in the university longer. But at some point, it just needs funding, and maybe it's going to get funding through the SBIR's TTR program, which is funding available through our federal government to support small businesses. But you have to have a business formed in order to do that. So it's not an easy thing to decide. And again, if you start early, you run the risk of getting stale before you can get far enough along. But you also run the risk, if you don't get it started, in not being able to advance the technology, because there's only so much we can do within the university in order to create value. So knowing when to quit is harder. You wouldn't think it would be, but it is. It can be difficult to know sort of when it's time to quit. And everybody says, and everybody understands, and investors say that it's okay to fail. And so failing actually gives you experience. But a critical component to knowing and being able to evaluate when it's time to make a no-go decision is making sure that you've done everything right up front. Surround yourself by smart people. Invite a board of advisors or a board of directors to the company. Invite the kind of people that are going to truly help you be able to make things happen and make decisions. Because if you don't feel like you've done that, you'll find yourself 4 or 5 years down the road. Now you're just getting to that, which means you may have to take another 3 or 4 years in order to give that opportunity a chance. And now you don't know whether part of the problem was just that it was too stale and you didn't make enough progress, and whether you did everything you could. So it is important to know when to fail. But it's just the best thing to do is do everything you can, surround yourself by smart people, so that it is much easier to, when you get to that point, not have to second guess yourself. Is there something else I should have done that that I didn't try, and now I want to try it, and now I've really extended my runway, and my 5-year experiment to get to a go or a no-go decision just turned into 10 years. So I wanted to, I guess, put up one more slide here and share one more sort of lesson, and then try to get into some of your questions that I see that are coming in on the chat. But it is important to file for good IP protection and to use CDAs when possible. We do that at Emory all the time. Sometimes we have a challenge in getting CDAs in place. Investors don't always like to see them. And we deal with that. I'm not one of those people who's overly paranoid about that if we've got good IP protection underway. And so we do try to make sure that we've got good patents filed. We still do try to put non-confidentiality or confidentiality agreements in place whenever possible. But we know if we've got good patent prosecution underway that we don't need to be as concerned about that. The other thing I would add is that that's one of the benefits of being in the life sciences space, because of the this feature that patents can be challenged years down the road. Companies, particularly pharma companies, are concerned about making sure that they get patents right and they get ownership correct. So trying to take advantage of a university by violating their confidential information and beating them to the patent office. It's not that it doesn't happen. It's just that there's a strong incentive to get ownership and inventorship correct. The other thing that I think is important to do is be credible, but be bold. Sometimes people think when they talk to big companies that they should be humble or too humble, and oftentimes want to even underprice their deal or their technology. I think it's important to make sure that you've really studied your comparative deals out there, and then go and ask the company what you think is a fair price for your technology, whether you're just licensing it out or whether you're looking for a corporate investor. The other thing that we've found is really important is to find connections within those companies that can be internal champions. Companies are being fed all sorts of opportunities every day and every week. And so if you've got an internal champion that can help introduce your technology to the management team or to the diligence team, it can really be important. We ran into challenges with multiple layers of sublicensing. If you are the licensor and your technology gets sub-licensed through multiple layers, it can be very difficult for you years down the road when a product is nearing the market to be confident that you're being paid the right royalties, the right deductions are being made. It can also be difficult to know whether a company is even being diligent about pursuing your technology because you're so far out of the communication loop. Because of the heavy component of federal funding into our technologies in academia, we must impose pretty strong due diligence requirements and clawback clauses. So it's not okay for companies to license our IP and shelve it in favor of another product. Or maybe they haven't even shelved it, but maybe they've got some concerns about something that came up at a clinical trial, and it's just not as important to them from a project or a product perspective as it used to be. We want to have the ability to get those technologies back. So I'm going to stop there. And again, I want to thank you all for your time. And I'd be happy to take questions for as long as time allows. I also, again, want to personally thank Nikhil, Premnath, and Pinky for helping me organize this and for becoming great partners in India for us.
Thank you, Todd. I think Pinky wants to take a picture first. So perhaps we'll give that a chance and then we'll come to questions. Is that okay?
Sure.
Yes. So Pinky, over to you.
Yeah, so just requesting people to turn on their camera. Dr. Todd, can you stop sharing your screen and just
Stop sharing my screen. Yes.
Yeah. Can people, whoever can, please turn on your cameras?
Perhaps you're on, you have given them, it's muted, is it? Yeah.
Yeah, how about now?
Yeah, I think people should be able to do it. Okay, let's quickly do it. Please join in the video and switch on your videos, please. I think still not allowed, please. Are you able to do it, Pinky?
Yeah, I can. I'll just check again. I did allow people to.
Yeah. While you're doing that, perhaps, yeah, okay. I think we can see many more people now. So Todd, we have a lot of people from different parts of India joining in, I think. So that's wonderful. We could, and there are a lot of questions, which of course I'm going to summarize a little bit and try to put them together for you, right? So, okay, Pinky, over to you.
Yeah, I'm actually almost done taking the photos.
Are you done?
Yeah, I'm done.
Okay, thank you, everybody. What we'll do is go into a round of questions right now. I've compiled a few which have come up in the chat box. If some of, oops, I'm sorry. Pinky, can you just get it started? Okay, great. We have several questions, Todd, and if you don't mind, I'll pull out a few and get started with that. There's a question which relates to basically the, you mentioned something about a killer experiment. Somebody wanted to understand what is an example of a good killer experiment. Can you please illustrate it with an example? You're on mute, Todd.
Thank you. Seems like I have to do that at least once every day. Yeah, so I remember a situation actually back when I was at Oregon Health Sciences University, and we had an inventor who had created a new molecule that she was calling herstatin. and it was supposed to have an impact on the EGF receptor. And she kept talking about how she had compared it to Herceptin, which was Genentech's product. And it took me a while to realize, so our investor kept looking at it and he kept saying, well, gosh, you know, Dr. Clinton says that she compared it to Herceptin, but she didn't. And it taught me two lessons. One is people outside the university don't understand the way we might look at and do science at the university. And also we need to understand what the killer experiment is. So in her mind, she had done the killer experiment because she had gone and looked up how this particular animal experiment was done for Herceptin. And then she emulated those experimental conditions in her lab. And in her mind, she had compared it to Herceptin. But the killer experiment and the experiment that our investor wanted was an actual side-by-side, where she had done that with, where she had compared it to Herceptin. Another example of that is we get disclosures all the time in the office for new cancer therapies, and we might have a cancer therapy that is that's touted to be a new therapeutic that could help address metastasis of cancer. And the animal model they used just showed that it prevented progression of the primary tumor. They didn't actually do an experiment to show that it had any impact on metastasis. And we see this a lot. We're using the wrong animal model. We use the animal model because that's what the lab was invested in, has done a lot of their publications around, but it's not the animal model that the market wants to see as the gold standard for the animal test for that particular therapeutic. So that would be an example of the killer experiment, the right experiment in the right animal model with the appropriate controls and comparisons.
So probably the experiment which basically proves the value claims that you're making, right, for your particular technology.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's a good point. I'm not sure where the term killer came from.
No, I think that's quite appropriate though.
But yeah, that's right. It's really just your key and value inflection point. What is your next value inflection point? What's the technical work that you can do that will demonstrate and de-risk your technology at the next stage? And I think part of the problem too is it is important to try to figure out what the next stage is. If you try to skip 3 steps and go all the way to the end, you may increase your odds that you get a false negative. Whereas if you take your experiments in order, it may help increase the odds that you get a good result.
Todd, can I request you to walk us through one of your blockbuster technology licenses and tell us how it progressed from beginning to end? Maybe I realize it will be a long story, but perhaps you can give us some highlights. And also, what were the key factors which made it possible? In the sense, there might have been points where you had to take difficult decisions or calls. And what or some unique opportunity came up. Would you like to take one case maybe and run us through it?
Yeah, so I'll give you an example of one of the HIV drugs. So back in the late 90s, there were a couple of HIV drugs. Well, AZT was already on the market, of course, but there was a drug called 3TC or lamivudine. And Emory was working through a disagreement with Glaxo around that. And in the process of doing that, a couple of our researchers had discovered that if you take 3TC and you put a fluorine in the 2' down position, that you could actually improve upon 3TC. And that drug became what's known as emtricitabine. And so as we got ready to license that, it was difficult to license. Everybody said, well, it's just a me too. It's not really going to be any different or any better than 3TC. And so there were some challenges in getting that license, but it eventually got placed into a startup company called Triangle Pharmaceutical. And it wasn't until Triangle Pharmaceutical got well into clinical stages of development, I'm forgetting now whether it was stage 1 or stage 2, that they were bought by Gilead Sciences. And even when it was first purchased by Gilead Sciences, it wasn't clear whether FTC would really have value or not. So it was a much slower development pathway for that drug than it should have been, simply because of the concern that it was a Me Too drug. We had litigation going on with Glaxo during the early phases of this over 3TC and over an inventorship dispute. But to our surprise and to our delight, both products made it to market. And it probably took 14 to 15 years compared with a drug that is on the market called Obizur to treat chronic hemophilia, which took 22 years to get to the market from date of disclosure to my office to final approval. And that was an interesting one because the timeline for it was basically because of what you just brought up, Prem. It was not viewed to be a blockbuster drug. It was to treat chronic hemophilia and also acute hemophilia. And what happened was that the clinical trials, there were very low numbers of people in clinical trials, but it was hard to get people enrolled in the clinical trial. And so we eventually had to start a company up around it because nobody else would take it. A French pharmaceutical company eventually bought part ownership interest in it. And the company still continued to struggle. And so the French pharma company took it all over and we started to cheer again, going, yay, it's going to make it. And the French pharma company lost interest in it and sublicensed it to a biotech company on the West Coast out of California focused on hemophilia products. And we thought, yay, now it's finally going to get all the way to market. Well, then that company went bankrupt and it came back to the French pharmaceutical company. And you can imagine the years are rolling by as all of this happens. And then the French pharma company offered it up for sale in an asset sale. And to our delight, Baxter bought it and finally got FDA approval for this drug to treat hemophilia 22 years after it had been discovered.
Mm-hmm. So what are the things that sort of make sure that the ball is not dropped by any of these players? Because it's so easy that everything could have just ended right there, isn't it? When the company say got bankrupt and so on. What keeps it going? Do you have to do anything as a tech transfer office to keep it going, or is it something which is just business driven?
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And when we first got started in tech transfer in this country, we assumed that our jobs were to license technologies. We would go talk to our researchers, they would disclose inventions, we would market them, we would license them, and we thought we were done. But it turns out that was only half the battle. The other half of the battle really is what happens after the license is completed. And that becomes so crucial. There are so many different ways that a university can address that situation and increase their odds. I mean, one of the things that I did was hire somebody on my staff, and I think it was one of the first people in the country. We were one of the first offices to have this position back in the early 2000 timeframe. That was to hire somebody with a legal background, who was litigation savvy, who was a PhD, a JD, who had worked in big pharma, who understood science, who understood the law, and have that person be on our team in the tech transfer office so that we never get behind in the intelligence with regards to what our companies are doing. And so we manage our relationships very closely with licenses in some cases that were done 5+ years ago, but are now in the clinical stages of development. And we stay toe to toe with them. We require regular meetings, and we make sure that we're collecting our annual reports. We try to do those in person whenever possible. We're more than happy to invite the pharma team, and it can be large teams, to the meetings and conversations with our patent counsel, and copy them on all correspondence to and from the Patent and Trademark Office so that they're fully informed and fully engaged. And we let them know that we're there watching what they do. And when things don't go right, you have to be willing to exercise your rights under the agreement. We will let them know that we're concerned that they're failing to meet diligence. And in some cases, we've actually required that they give something back. We got a drug back that was on partial clinical hold, actually from Gilead, after they had gotten emtricitabine to market. They had another drug from us called imdoxavir that was put on partial clinical hold. And we said, we'd like to have that drug back. And they said, well, there are clinical trials ongoing, Emory will have to provide the drug. And we said, well, we think you should continue to provide it. You agreed to do that. There are patients that started those clinical trials on your watch in good faith. And we think that it's your obligation to continue to provide that drug for those clinical studies. And so we were able to get the drug back, hired a consultant, cataloged all of the data so that we could hand it over to a new company. And we did start a new company up around it that then took that and moved forward. So these are some of the kinds of things we can do at the university that will increase our odds. We've seen in the US now that universities have to occasionally go through some form of dispute resolution. That costs money. It's good to have an informed senior leadership at your institution so that they're prepared to make a tough decision and a high risk, high reward decision.
Okay. Can you tell me how much time we have? Because I can then guide the questions accordingly. There are quite a few questions, Todd. I would love to take them up, but maybe would we have another 10, 15 minutes?
I do. It's
Yes. Okay. Yeah. I was asking you. Okay. So let's go with a few questions. So Deepali had a question about basically the process of what can innovators, for example, do to reduce risk of failure? Is there something that one can do? Savita had a question on similar lines, but slightly ahead upstream about what mindsets does a researcher need to have to witness their ideas transitioning from academic environment to the industry?
Yeah. So I can't emphasize enough, I think, the importance of surrounding oneself by the smartest people you can possibly find. And by the smartest people, that usually means people that have done it before, but that can be difficult, right? I mean, if you're an academic scientist and you're pursuing your own startup, finding a management team can be challenging. But one of the part of the thinking that I think has to be in the minds of the early stage people is that they may not be fundable. And they may just be a project manager trying to get the technology and the project to a value inflection point where maybe the real management team can make a decision about coming on board, or an investor can make a decision about coming on board. I'm amazed at how often I see either our scientist or our first ostensible CE come on board, and they drive a stake in the ground and they tie themselves to the stake, and then they go out and they try to find funding. And they may not be fundable. And if they are not fundable, by definition, the company won't be fundable and the technology will go down in flames. And so that in and of itself, I think is the single biggest mistake that I see be made in our companies, is not understanding that if you want your investment to succeed, and your investment doesn't have to mean you put money in, it could mean that you put time into it. If you want to see that succeed and pay off, you must find the smartest and the best people, and you must be prepared to step aside if the people that are going to put the money in say, I'll take the technology and I'll fund the company, but I need a different management team. And if you're not willing to do that, then you better find funding from somebody who will agree to do that, or watch your investment. It's critically important to recognize and to know what you don't know.
Mm-hmm. There are quite a few questions which relate to IP, tech transfer, and startups, and some amount of funding. So let me go with startups first. Can you tell us, how do you take a decision on who to go with, large companies or startups? And when you talk about startups out of Emory, do they have, are they, the question somebody had asked was, do they have to be people who, where scientists are involved, or it doesn't have to be so? I mean, what is the definition of a startup? That's what Vinita had asked. And furthermore, what are the kind of arrangements that one strikes between startups and the universities? And how does it really work out? For example, in your case, you have the case of university, drive, and then startups, right? How do you structure your arrangements such that the IP rights are clear and not very confused or murky between different players?
And did you mention Drive, Premnath?
Yeah. Between
Yeah.
university, drive, and say startups, for example, right? As an
Yeah.
example, but you might be having others as well, such
Right.
similar entities
Yeah. So first of all, the simple question is what do we term a startup company? And to us, a startup company is not necessarily one that is driven by an Emory faculty member, but it is a startup that, as it gets put together, its primary assets are in Emory technology. So if it met that definition, we would call it a startup company. Drive is a special sort of wholly owned subsidiary that does license a few technologies at Emory, and they run much the same way a company would run with regards to risk reduction and value creation. And we'll license to them, and when they are ready to go out and find additional funds, then they will either license that out or spin that out into a company themselves. And of course, people may be familiar with our COVID drug, molnupiravir, which came from Emory through Drive to Ridgeback and then to Merck. But that's not the typical path for our technologies. And what we're looking for is so the decision about whether to do a startup or take a license, we almost never have the two options available. As a matter of fact, in 30 years, I can count on one hand, certainly two, the number of times that we've had more than one bidder for a technology. It just doesn't happen that way, at least not in my experience. I wish we had bidders more often, but we don't. And so oftentimes, not oftentimes, generally speaking, the rule is that we'll go with the option that is available to us. Now, there are some times where the faculty member wants to start a company, but their heart's not really in it, and we might try to steer them away from it. There are other times where the faculty is not that engaged, where we might steer them towards a startup because we believe that it is an asset or a platform technology that would make a good startup, and believe that we've got good preclinical data. And so we might want to push it the startup direction. In either of those situations, our goal is to get the business people engaged in those companies as quickly as we can. But another lesson and another thing that we see our startups do wrong is bring your management teams on board and then fully vest them with their equity position on day one. What they should do, but they just don't know, and they're also not that comfortable having the conversation, is put their management team on a vesting schedule. You know, you get a quarter of your equity now, you get a quarter of it next year, you get a quarter of it when you've raised the first round of funding, you know, however you want to structure that. But we want to see those type of people be engaged in our startups, the kind of people that are fundable. I think I missed a few of those questions in there. Can you think of one or two? I'm not sure I hit them all, but.
No, I think you covered most of it. Let me move on to another question, which has got to do with startups licensing from universities in licensing. Vaibhav has a question that if a startup is say, licensing from a university, what are the typical arrangements in terms of upfront fees, milestone fees, royalties, or patent reimbursements and so on? What are the typical norms, and what are the metrics used by university tech transfer offices to follow the progress of a technology and to see whether they should continue with it or pull back and claw back the license? And does that happen? And these are some of the questions which he's put. And if a big pharma also follows similar norms, or is it something different between a startup and a big pharma licensing from a university startup, a university TTO?
Yeah, there's always the deal question, isn't there? How do we structure the deal? So the common deal structure for us, and it's pretty common if I compare it to our colleagues too, is to have an upfront component, patent reimbursement, milestones, and a royalty. And whether it's a therapeutic or it's a device company, those are the financial considerations that we look for in the deal. Now, if it's a startup company, the upfront component has to be equity. And we might have to be much more forgiving on reimbursement of patent expenses. We may have to look at a schedule for reimbursing. Of course, when dealing with a pharma company that is cash poor and isn't going to give away its equity, we can charge much higher upfront fees, and we can also expect sort of full reimbursement of patent expenses on day one. Another difference between a startup and a pharma license for us is probably in the size of the milestones. If we found that if we put the size of milestones in a startup deal that we do in a pharma deal, that we scare away more the early management team than we even do the investors. I mean, by the time those companies are going to get this phase 2 or phase 3 clinical studies, they're going to have raised substantial amounts of money, and our milestone payments won't look so big. But there's a sticker shock, it seems like, for early stage management teams to see really large milestone payments, whether that's therapeutic or device. But the other thing that's interesting is universities, depending upon where you're at, they have a different take on where they want to make their money in those compartments. What I can tell you at Emory, having had a couple of big hit technologies now, is that we place our value in the royalty component. We've learned that we're not going to make a bunch of money in the upfront component of the deal, and in particular in equity. And part of the reason we're never going to make big money in equity at universities, at least in the US, is that most universities have decided that they're going to sell their equity immediately upon expiration of lockup. So that means at the earliest possible date, they're going to sell their equity. And I think, as most of us understand, that's not probably going to be the value, the peak of value for that company. So, but royalties are different. Royalties can carry on for years. And even a relatively small percent royalty, let's say in the 5% range, which is typically what we're negotiating for a therapeutic deal, plus or minus. We've got plenty of examples of where it's in excess of 5%. Whereas I would say for medical device companies, we find ourselves maybe more in the 2 to 3% plus or minus. It's not that we don't go above that. But because the exits are lower for medical device companies in general than therapeutics, we tend to have to lower the economic considerations.
Do you have situations where these royalty clauses are negotiated into one-time payments at a later date?
Into one-time payments at a later date?
Yeah, in terms of somebody just wants to terminate the licensing, the royalty streams, and therefore is willing to say close the deal with a one-time payment, and not so that the university is not expecting continuous payments over a very long period of time.
Yeah, I've never done a deal in 30 years where we agreed upfront in the deal that the company could cash out the royalty at a predetermined value. Mm-hmm. And I don't even know that it's that we wouldn't do that necessarily. It's that we would never be able to agree upon a value. Mm-hmm. Because the company is going to have to assume that if we're going to set the price of the payout, it's going to have to be low, and we're going to want it to be high, and we'll never reach an agreement. Having said that, anytime we get to a royalty stage, or even before that, a company can always approach us over a buyout. It's just that we'll have to go through a process to determine what fair market value is. So in my experience, there's no real value for a company to have that language in the agreement, unless what they're hoping they can do is get the licensor to agree to a low value and set the value. Then it's a real benefit to the company. If the deal is just going to be that we're going to both look at it and negotiate what the value is, you've got those rights, whether it's built into the contract or not. Now there are a few deals I've done over the years, for example, where we did an all equity deal. I mean, in software technologies, I can think of a few times where we said we don't want, it isn't worth negotiating the royalty because of the short shelf life. We'll just negotiate the equity component instead. So we have built deals that way.
Mhm. Are there situations where the license has been converted to an assignment? And if so, how does that work?
There have been examples of that. There have been situations where things just got sticky between us and the company. And I'm struggling to remember. I can remember a couple of situations where that happened, where maybe there's some concern over the patent rights. And so we have reluctantly decided to assign the agreement. And we'll just assign our ownership. Or in a better example is a situation where, and this did happen more recently now that I think about it, where 90% of the IP pre-existed before the invention was made by a faculty member who'd spent most of the time at another university. And then they come here, they spend a year, they make a small improvement type invention. And in that situation, rather than continue to own those IP rights and license it, we just agreed to assign the rights to that company, let them keep their ownership whole, and then we were to collect a very small nominal royalty based upon the eventual sale of a product.
There are a few small questions which stand alone. So one of them relates to your comment on the concept of technology and companies getting stale. Can you elaborate on that with some examples? Is a question from Anuya.
Yeah, we've got a number of startups that fit into this category, and it's not easy necessarily. It's not like there's a bright line, I think, that a company crosses and it was fresh and now the next day it's stale. But if you find your company 8 years down the road, and again, it's going to depend on what the company has done, right? But having achieved very little from a technology development standpoint, have not been able to raise any money. You've pitched to pretty much every investor at least once. You've participated in a number of your innovation ecosystems, incubators or accelerators, and you've been doing that, and you still just can't find funding. And you find yourself not having anybody new to talk to. That could be an indication that you're getting stale. Now, It doesn't mean that termination is the only answer. I mean, I can think of a couple of companies, including the hemophilia drug I told you about, that looked stale, that got stale. And it's not that you can't beat the odds and still come back at some point and find yourself on a path to market. I've seen a number of examples, but I could count them on one hand over the last 3 decades of a company that really, truly just rose from the ashes after a long, lengthy period of having no success and was eventually able to be successful. So it can happen.
A couple of quick questions on funding. You did mention, in fact, you said that only 10% of research funding in Emory, for example, comes from industry. In the public funding space, what do you think, which kind of programs would you list as the top ones which sort of contribute really to innovations and advancing technology? Would you say things like SBRI are doing that? And on a related note, Vinay Mehta has a question about the ARPA-H fundings that's been announced. Do you think that's going to change healthcare research and tech development ecosystem in the US?
Yeah, so any funding source, most any funding source by definition is a good funding source, right? I mean, at universities, at least here in the US, the name of the game is to bring money in the door to support research. So our standard traditional R01 NIH grant support is probably the most valuable type if I had to pick a type at the university that I thought was valuable, because it funds just good old exploratory mechanistic work. and we get a lot of it, and out of a lot of it trickles a little bit of innovation. And some of the most revolutionary types of inventions are going to tend to come out of that kind of work. But we do love all types of funding. And people will remember the 2008 global financial crisis, where where economies, world economies all over the globe were going down, and countries we were all trying to figure out what to do to sort of save our economy. And what somebody eventually figured out, or what the mantra sort of went, is that, okay, in order to do that and create, we need jobs. And where do jobs come from? Well, they come from companies that are less than 5 years old. Okay, what do new companies need if we need young companies? Well, they need people, they need money, and they need technology. So, so innovation sort of saved the day for the 2008 global financial crisis, and it's doing so again during the 2020 pandemic. Everybody turns to innovation. So from the company perspective, SBIR's TTR support, yes, I would say is vitally important to our companies. The challenge is that sometimes companies end up getting on the SBIR, STTR bandwagon of funding, and they end up being very good at that and not as good at getting the venture funding that they will eventually have to have in order to make it to the market. If you can make it to the market on government funding, that would be fine, but it's been very challenging in this country to make it all the way to the market on government funding. But some of our companies make the mistake. They think they're going to find venture funding earlier than they do. And so they'll pass up this year's deadline or this quarter's deadline to submit an SBIR STTR grant application, and it can take 6 months or more to get that funding in the door. So you don't want to look back after you get down the road and say, boy, I wish I had. The better approach is to sort of do it up front.
Yes, Todd.
So the ARPA,
yeah, we have the similar kind of a situation. Please continue.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, so the ARPA H funding program, I don't know, it's going to be interesting to see. One of the things, again, that happened after the 2008 global financial crisis is biotech went bankrupt. Big Pharma said, we're getting out of the drug discovery business. And to my somewhat surprise, we in academia and the federal government sort of like raised our hands and said, we'll do it. I don't know whether history is going to prove that the federal government and universities were any better at drug discovery than biotech and pharma were. But programs, and so we're seeing a lot of funding these days, as you all know, whether it's DARPA or ARPA or BARDA or the NIH funding applied research. You know, when I got into the tech transfer business 30 years ago, we launched we threw our new technologies over the wall, and we expected academia to come and pick them up. And if we didn't, we blamed academia. And then it was like one day, 5-10 years later, we crawled up over the wall and we looked and we saw, oh my gosh, there's another wall, and it's way off in the distance, and there's nobody in between those two walls. So we keep, one of the things that's really changed decade by decade over the last 40 years since the passage of the Bayh-Dole Act is the amount of effort and money that universities and the federal government are putting into not just discovery, basic research, but applied research. And so ARPA-H is another example of that. It'll be interesting to see where things are at in another 10, 15 years, because the other thing we have upon us now is the lessons we've learned during the pandemic. We have demonstrated that some medicines can be brought to market very quickly in the middle of a pandemic, whether it was our molnupiravir drug or whether it was the vaccines for COVID. And so now, isn't it maddening that not every therapeutic has the opportunity to get to the market that quickly? So I hope that what we're going to find is that timelines for product discovery and approval, that we found some new and better ways to accelerate that. And I think that's where ARPA-H could really play a role.
Okay. My final question, Todd, in the context of what you mentioned, there's a lot of buzz right now in the US about so-called focused research organizations, and people like Schmidt Futures and Convergent Research talking about that. There was an article in Nature about that as well. And of course, I suppose the original version of that is Drive, because it's a not-for-profit research organization which is very focused, right? And this comes up in the context of the discussion that somehow industry and academia to some extent had failed during COVID, right? In some ways. Well, I realize that's not true entirely. There are a lot of stuff that came from all of these organizations. But nonetheless, what are your views on that? And I want to understand whether there's a future for that, especially in therapeutics research, especially which is not focused on, say, chronic diseases. And how do we go about it? What are some thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, one thought is that, again, right back to value creation, risk reduction and value creation. There is no shortcut. We have to run that gauntlet. And that's what Drive does. Yes, they are laser focused on risk reduction and value creation. And so just like any good startup should be focused on that, that's what Drive is focused on. What makes Drive a bit unique is that it's within the academic structure, and yet they're laser focused on risk reduction.
Todd, can you briefly talk a little bit about Drive for the audience who may not have the background?
Yeah, so Drive, which stands for Drug Innovation Ventures at Emory, is a wholly owned subsidiary of Emory. And it is a very small group of people. The CEO is a former president and CEO of Chimerix. He's an expert in finding funding from the federal government, large funding from the federal government, like BARDA and other institutes, and also an antiviral expert. And he's a drug hunter. He's able to he understands drug discovery, drug development, regulatory, clinical aspects of drug approval. He understands disease and what it takes to manage a disease and what kind of therapies are going to work. So he's a very unusual person. And the reason we were able to attract him to Emory and the reason we're able to create a Drive was because we had monetized our HIV drug royalties in emtricitabine in 2005 for a one-time payment of $540 million. And so that money that came back to the institution was plowed back into research and education. And it helped fund Drive and provide that funding. And because we had that funding, we were able to attract someone like a George Painter. And if it weren't for the HIV drugs and the HIV drug royalties, there would never have been a Drive, and we would never have discovered molnupiravir. So we were able to do what we always said we would do as a recipient of funds and licensing revenue, and that is pour that back in through drug discovery and development and discover the next promising therapeutic. So anyway, I think that these focused type of activities and funding sources like that are here to stay. Our innovation ecosystems these days are funded with all sorts of programs. Again, what'll be interesting to see is what's left standing in 10 years. I think the things that can truly help address risk reduction and value creation will be left standing. Things that don't truly focus on that, it's not as clear to me what we'll be left with. I know when I was on the Hill as autumn president, I had a congressman staffer shake his finger in my face and say that that research and universities had failed the country. That and he was comparing the increase in federal funding that went into universities against the approval of new drug applications. And based upon that comparison, came to the conclusion that it wasn't a good return on investment for the public. And boy, I'm not even sure where to start with a sentiment like that. I mean, the reason that we fund all this research is to contribute to the world's knowledge, train tomorrow's workforce, and when something can be commercializable, commercialize it. But there are a lot of reasons we fund research. And if somebody is going to always compare that against new drug approvals, it's going to be challenging. And I do worry as we've stepped into the gap further as universities and the federal government to say, we'll do that early stage, that risky work. We're going to be held more and more accountable for those new drug approvals at the end of the day. That's what the world wants to see, is promising new affordable therapies that can change their lives. And how effective are we going to be at doing that remains to be seen.
Thank you very much, Todd. I think We're grateful for your wonderful work at Emory and the drugs that you're bringing to the world as well. It has a great impact here as well in India. So thank you very much. And at the same time, thank you for sharing your insights today. Very happy to hear you speak, and I hope we can build on this further as we go ahead as well. I think with that, I'll turn the floor over to Pinky.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Premnath, and thank you, Dr. Todd, for a really nice seminar today. It was very simple, easy to follow, with plenty of learnings, I think, for everyone here. So thank you very much again for your time.
Sorry, you're on. Yeah.
Yeah, you are very welcome. I really appreciate you inviting me, and I hope that everybody has a wonderful evening. And best of luck. Best of luck to all of us in the innovation space.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. I'll be ending the meeting here. Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.